The soft chime of the store's entrance bell barely registered over the hum of fluorescent lights. Malik Carter stepped inside, adjusting the hood of his sweatshirt as a rush of cold air followed him. The store smelled like coffee, freshly mopped floors, and a hint of something fried from the deli in the back. It was late evening. The streets outside still slipped from the earlier rain. Malik wasn't in the mood for trouble. He had just wrapped up basketball practice and stopped by the corner store for a sports drink and a protein bar before heading home. His father, Mayor Charles Carter, always insisted on family dinners, and he was already running late. But the moment Malik stepped in, he felt it, the weight of an unwelcome gaze. Behind the counter, a middle-aged clerk with thinning hair and thick glasses froze mid-counting a stack of cash. His name tag read Dennis Walker, and his eyes flicked toward Malik with suspicion. His grip on the register tightened as if Malik had already pulled a weapon. Malik ignored him and headed down an aisle. The store was mostly empty, save for an older woman browsing magazines and a man picking out beer from the refrigerated section. Malik grabbed a drink from the cooler and reached for a protein bar when a shadow moved behind him. Dennis was watching him. The clerk's presence was almost suffocating. Malik could hear his nervous breathing, the way his shoes scuffed against the linoleum floor. The teenager clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He was used to this. Being a tall black teen in an expensive neighborhood came with a set of unspoken rules. Don't run, don't linger too long, don't touch anything you're not buying. But no matter how many rules he followed, people like Dennis Walker still saw him as a threat. Malik exhaled slowly, stepping toward the counter. Dennis stiffened. Just these, Malik said, placing his items down. Dennis didn't move. His hand hovered near the phone behind the register, his fingers twitching. Malik could see the hesitation in his eyes, the way he sized him up like he was deciding whether or not to press some silent alarm. That all? Dennis finally asked, his voice tight. Yeah. Dennis scanned the drink and protein bar, but his eyes never left Malik. As he bagged the items, he cleared his throat. You live around here? Malik arched an eyebrow. Yeah, why? Dennis swallowed, forcing a laugh. Just making conversation. Malik reached for his wallet, pulling out a 20. But before he could hand it over, Dennis stepped back. I think you should leave, the clerk said, his voice sharper now. Malik frowned. What? You don't belong in a place like this. The words hit Malik like a slap. His fingers curled around the 20, his jaw tightening. I'm just trying to buy my stuff. Dennis shook his head. I've seen kids like you before, hanging around looking suspicious. You come in, act like you're shopping, but I know what you're really up to. Malik's chest burned. Are you serious? Dennis' hand darted to the phone. I think you should step outside before I call the cops. Malik stared at him, disbelief surging through him like a storm. He could hear his father's voice in his head, telling him to stay calm, to never give them a reason. But it was so hard, when the man in front of him had already decided he was guilty of something. Dennis lifted the phone, and Malik made a choice. He turned around and walked out, but as he pushed through the door, he caught sight of Dennis pressing a button on the phone. Malik's stomach dropped. Dennis had called the cops. Outside, the rain had started again, a soft drizzle coating the pavement. Malik clenched his fists, pacing under the store's awning. He could have left. He could have just gone home and told his dad. But the thought of running just made him angrier. He had done nothing wrong. His father always told him that he had a right to be anywhere, to never let people make him feel like he didn't belong. But how could he not feel that way when a single store trip ended with him being treated like a criminal? Then the sirens came. Blue and red lights reflected off the wet pavement, growing brighter as a patrol car pulled up. Two officers stepped out, their hands already resting on their holsters. Malik raised his hands, already knowing the drill. The lead officer, a burly man with a badge that read Officer Grant, strode forward, his expression unreadable. The other cop, younger and wiry, hovered close behind. Dennis rushed outside, waving toward the officers. "That's it," the clerk barked. He was acting suspicious, lurking around, probably trying to steal something. Malik gritted his teeth. "I didn't steal anything." Grant narrowed his eyes. "Hands where we can see them, kid." Malik's heart pounded as both officers advanced, their movements controlled but tense. "I just came in to buy something," Malik said evenly. Dennis scoffed. "Yeah, right. I saw him sneaking around, looking at the cameras, like he was planning something." Malik's fists clenched. "That's a lie." The younger officer reached for his radio. "We might need to run his ID." Malik knew where this was heading. His father had drilled it into him time and time again. Never resist, never escalate, no sudden movements. But the injustice of it boiled under his skin like fire. "Check the cameras," Malik said through clenched teeth. "I didn't do anything." Grant didn't look convinced. "We'll get to that. For now, I need you to turn around and place your hands on the wall." Malik's breath hitched. This couldn't be happening. Dennis watched with satisfaction, arms crossed, as the younger officer moved in. Malik's body went rigid as he felt a hand grab his wrist. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the officer warned. Malik's eyes burned. Then, the sound of another car pulling up cut through the tension. A sleek black vehicle screeched to a halt. The door flew open. A tall, commanding figure stepped out. And just like that, the energy in the air shifted. Officer Grant stiffened. Dennis took a nervous step back. Malik's stomach lurched. His father had arrived. The tension outside the store thickened like an approaching storm. The flashing police lights reflected off the wet pavement, their red and blue hues flickering across Malik's tense face. His pulse pounded in his ears as his father, Mayor Charles Carter, slammed his car door shut and strode toward them with an air of quiet authority. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his long overcoat flaring behind him, Charles Carter was a man who commanded attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the weight of someone who had spent years fighting to prove he belonged. His sharp eyes, nearly identical to Malik's, swept across the scene in one swift glance, and his jaw tightened. Officer Grant straightened, his fingers twitching away from his holstered gun. The younger officer, whose name tag read Harrison, shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. Dennis, the store clerk, seemed less sure of himself now, but still clung to his accusation like a lifeline. "Sir, I need you to stay back," Grant started. But Charles cut him off with a look. His voice was smooth, but laced with authority. "That's my son." Grant hesitated. His eyes darted between Charles and Malik, as if trying to process what that meant. Harrison exchanged a glance with his partner, clearly recognizing the mayor now. Dennis' confidence wavered for the first time. "Mayor Carter." Charles ignored him. He stepped toward Malik, who was still standing stiffly, his hands clenched at his sides. "You okay?" his father asked, his voice low but urgent. Malik's breath was unsteady. He had been holding back his anger, swallowing it down like a bitter pill. But now that his father was here, the floodgates threatened to burst. "He called the cops on me," Malik said, his voice tight. "For no reason." Charles turned his gaze on Dennis, his expression unreadable. The store clerk swallowed hard but lifted his chin. He was acting suspicious. Charles took a deliberate step forward. "Explain." Dennis fidgeted but tried to maintain his composure. "I saw him hanging around, looking at the cameras, acting nervous. I thought he was going to steal something." Malik exhaled sharply. "I wasn't stealing anything. I came to buy a drink and a protein bar." "That's it." Grant cleared his throat. "Sir," the clerk had concerns. "So we were just following protocol." Charles turned toward the officers, his expression darkening. "Protocol? Your protocol is to assume my son is a criminal because he walked into a store." Grant bristled. "Sir, we don't." "You had him put his hands on the wall," Charles interrupted, his voice calm but lethal. "You were about to search him. Did you even check the store cameras? Or did you take one man's word and assume guilt?" Harrison shifted on his feet. "We were just trying to de-escalate." "De-escalate," Charles repeated, his eyes narrowing. By treating my son like a suspect. What exactly were you de-escalating? His right to buy a drink? The officers had no answer. Dennis, sensing that the situation was turning against him, took a step forward. Look, Mr. Carter, it's Mayor Carter, Charles corrected coldly. Dennis flinched. Mayor Carter, I was just looking out for my store. You have to understand, we get a lot of trouble around here. Charles tilted his head. And by trouble, you mean black teenagers? Dennis paled. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Malik crossed his arms. You told me I didn't belong in a place like this. What does that mean? Dennis opened his mouth, then shut it. His gaze flickered to the officers, as if looking for support, but neither of them seemed willing to back him up now. Charles took a slow step forward, his voice dangerously quiet. My son is a straight-A student. He's captain of his basketball team. He's been raised to be respectful, to follow the rules, and to never give people like you a reason to doubt him. He exhaled sharply. And yet, here we are. Dennis shifted uncomfortably. I was just doing my job. Your job. Charles' eyes darkened. Your job is to run a store, not to police who gets to shop in it. The store clerk had no response. Charles turned back to the officers. Are we done here? Or do you intend to arrest my son for buying something? Grant's jaw tightened, but after a long pause, he sighed and gave Harrison a nod. The younger officer hesitated, then reached for his radio. Cancel that. No further action needed. Malik exhaled, some of the tension in his chest easing. Dennis, however, wasn't ready to let it go. You can't just walk in here and intimidate me, Carter, he snapped. You might be the mayor, but that doesn't mean you get special treatment. Charles slowly turned, his expression unreadable. Special treatment. Dennis swallowed but didn't back down. I run an honest business. If I say someone is suspicious, that should be enough. You can't force me to serve everyone. Charles studied him for a long, heavy moment. Then he gave a small, knowing smile. Let's see if you still feel that way when the whole city knows what you did. Dennis froze. What? Charles pulled out his phone. I think the people of this community deserve to know how their local businesses treat innocent teenagers. He tapped the screen, lifting the phone just enough to make it clear he was recording now. Go ahead, Dennis. Explain why you felt the need to call the cops on my son. Dennis' face drained of color. You wouldn't. Charles lifted an eyebrow. Wouldn't I? The store clerk's bravado cracked. His gaze darted toward the officers, but neither of them made a move to stop the mayor. The power dynamics had shifted completely. Mayor Carter, Grant said carefully, maybe we should handle this through the proper channels. Charles didn't lower his phone. Oh, don't worry. I intend to. Dennis took a shaky breath. Look, I didn't mean for it to get this far. Malik let out a bitter laugh. It always goes too far. And then people like you pretend it wasn't your fault. Dennis swallowed hard. He looked around, as if expecting someone to rescue him. But no help came. Charles finally lowered his phone, slipping it back into his pocket. This isn't over, he promised. Malik watched as his father turned toward the car. Come on, son. Let's go. As they walked away, Dennis stood frozen in place, his hands trembling. Malik didn't have to look back to know that, for the first time, the store clerk was the one feeling out of place. The drive home was tense, the silence between father and son stretching like a tightrope. The city lights blurred past as Malik stared out the window, jaw clenched, arms crossed. He could still hear Dennis' voice in his head. You don't belong in a place like this. The words stung, carving into his pride like a blade. His father, Mayor Charles Carter, kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his face unreadable. The air inside the car felt thick, charged with unspoken words. Finally, Charles exhaled and broke the silence. I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Malik didn't look away from the window. What's the point? You saw what happened. That's not the point. Charles' voice was measured but firm. The details matter. You might think this was just another bad encounter, but I need to know exactly how it went down. Malik's jaw tightened, but he finally relented. He recounted everything the moment he walked into the store, the way Dennis had watched him like a hawk, how the accusation escalated within minutes, and the way the officers had treated him like he was guilty before even asking questions. Charles listened without interrupting, his fingers flexing against the leather steering wheel. When Malik finished, his father was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You realize this isn't just about you, right?" Malik frowned, turning toward him. "What do you mean?" Charles kept his eyes on the road. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened in this city. It won't be the last. And the problem isn't just that it happened to you, it's that it happens at all." Malik's fists clenched. "Yeah, well, knowing that doesn't make it any easier." His father nodded slowly. "No, it doesn't. But you have something most people in your position don't." Malik arched an eyebrow. "What? A dad in office?" Charles shot him a sidelong glance. "Power." Malik scoffed. "Power? I was 2 seconds away from getting thrown in the back of a squad car for buying a drink. What kind of power is that?" His father pulled into their driveway and put the car in park before turning fully to face him. "The kind that doesn't let this slide." Malik studied his father's expression. It was the same look he had seen in press conferences, in campaign speeches, in debates, sharp, focused, and unyielding. Charles didn't just want justice. He wanted change. Malik sighed, running a hand over his face. "So, what now? You're going to hold a press conference? Sue the store? Fire those cops?" Charles shook his head. "This isn't about making an example out of one store clerk or 2 cops. It's bigger than that. This is about the system that allows people like Dennis to feel entitled to call the cops on kids like you for no reason. It's about why officers respond to those calls as if a crime has already been committed. This is about making sure it doesn't happen again." Malik exhaled through his nose. "And how do you do that?" Charles unbuckled his seatbelt. "By making sure the right people are paying attention." The fallout begins. The next morning, Malik woke up to chaos. His phone buzzed endlessly with messages, friends, classmates, even people he barely spoke to were reaching out. Social media was flooded with a video taken from across the street. Someone had recorded the entire altercation outside the store, capturing the moment the officers arrived, the way they ordered him against the wall, and his father's arrival. But what had really set the internet on fire was the final exchange. Charles Carter standing tall, staring Dennis down, promising that it wasn't over. The hashtag justice for Malik was already trending. Malik scrolled through the posts, his stomach twisting. Some people were furious on his behalf, calling out the store's racist policies and the officers' biased handling of the situation. Others were defending Dennis, claiming he was just doing his job, arguing that businesses had the right to call the cops if they felt uncomfortable. Then there were the threats. Another rich kid crying racism. Must be nice having daddy bail you out. Maybe if you dressed normal and acted respectful, people wouldn't be scared of you. He's lucky those cops didn't actually do their job. Malik clenched his phone so tightly his knuckles ached. He had seen this before. Victims turned into villains, their stories twisted, their pain dismissed. He looked up as his father entered the room, his expression unreadable. "You've seen it," Charles said. Malik nodded. "It's everywhere." His father sat down on the edge of his bed. "The store has already released a statement. They're calling it a misunderstanding." Malik laughed bitterly. "Of course they are." Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The police department is reviewing the incident. I've already spoken to the chief. He's trying to handle this quietly." Malik scoffed. "Of course he is." His father's expression hardened. "We're not letting this go, Malik." Malik hesitated. "Dad, I don't want to become some political pawn. I don't want my face plastered everywhere like I'm some victim who needs saving." Charles' gaze softened. "You're not a pawn, and you're not just a victim. You're a fighter. But sometimes, Malik, the fight isn't just about you." Malik swallowed. He wanted to believe that, but he wasn't sure if the world would ever see him as anything other than a threat. Dennis faces the consequences. Meanwhile, across town, Dennis sat in his small office at the back of the store, staring at his computer screen in horror. His inbox was flooded with hate mail. His store's online reviews had tanked overnight, and people were calling for a boycott. His phone buzzed for the 100th time that morning. He snatched it up and answered. "This is Dennis." "Dennis, what the hell is going on?" It was the store's regional manager, his voice sharp with anger. "I've got corporate breathing down my neck because of you." Dennis licked his lips. "I didn't mean for this to blow up like this. He looked suspicious." Suspicious? He was the mayor's son. Dennis rubbed his temple, his pulse pounding. "I didn't know that." "It shouldn't matter," the manager snapped. "You profiled a kid and called the cops on him for buying a drink. And now, thanks to you, we're in a PR nightmare." Dennis swallowed hard. "I was just trying to protect the store." His boss sighed heavily. "Corporate wants a full investigation. Until then, you're suspended." Dennis' stomach dropped. Suspended? Be grateful it's not worse. The line went dead. Dennis slumped back in his chair, his face pale. This was spiraling out of control, and deep down, for the first time, he wondered if he had truly made a mistake. The tension in the city thickened like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. The controversy surrounding Dennis, the store clerk, and Malik, the mayor's son, was no longer just a local incident, it was national news. Reporters swarmed outside City Hall, demanding statements. Protesters lined the streets, holding up signs that read, "Racial profiling stops here. You don't belong in a place like this. Neither do your policies." Justice for Malik. Social media was ablaze with debates. Some called for Dennis to be fired, for the officers involved to be suspended, for sweeping changes to be made. Others defended Dennis, painting him as a victim of cancel culture, and accusing Malik of playing the race card. Inside the Carter home, Malik sat on the couch, flipping through the news channels, every headline dissecting his life. Mayor's son accused of shoplifting or just shopping while black. City store faces backlash after racial incident. Is it a wake-up call? Boycotts begin. Will business owners finally be held accountable? Malik's phone vibrated with another incoming call. He ignored it. He had already spoken to more reporters, activists, and even family members than he ever wanted to in a lifetime. His father sat across from him, his face unreadable. "How are you holding up?" Malik let out a dry laugh. "You mean, how am I handling the fact that my face is everywhere? And half the country either wants to make me a symbol or wants me to shut up." Charles sighed. "I know this isn't easy." Malik threw the remote onto the table. "You know what's wild? If you weren't you, this would have been swept under the rug already. If you weren't the mayor, I'd be just another black kid who looked suspicious." Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That's exactly why we can't let this go." Malik met his father's gaze. He saw the fire burning in his father's eyes, the same fire that had carried him through years of politics, fighting for change in a system that didn't want to change. "You said this was bigger than me," Malik murmured. "It is," Charles said. "And now people are watching?" Dennis on the defensive. Across town, Dennis sat in his darkened apartment, his hands gripping his phone as he scrolled through the endless flood of messages. Hate mail, death threats, people calling him a racist, a disgrace, a coward. "Hope you lose your job. You deserve worse. Why are you scared of black kids? Do better. I hope you never work in this city again." His hands trembled. He had never imagined this would explode the way it did. When he made that call, he thought he was doing the right thing. That's what they trained him to do, watch for suspicious activity. But now, with every news report replaying that moment, with every social media post dissecting his actions, he couldn't shake one thought. Had he overreacted? His phone rang. It was his boss. Dennis hesitated before answering. "Hello, you're fired." Dennis' heart slammed into his ribs. "Wait, what? The store can't afford to keep you on. Corporate made the call. Too much bad publicity." Dennis shot to his feet. But, I was following protocol." Your protocol got us boycotted. His boss snapped. We've lost half our customers in 2 days. They want a scapegoat, Dennis, and you're it. Dennis felt the blood drain from his face. But the line went dead. Dennis staggered backward, his legs weak, his job gone, his reputation ruined. And for what? He had just been doing his job, hadn't he? The officers speak out. Meanwhile, at the police department, the officers involved in Malik's case were under scrutiny. The video of them pressing Malik against the wall had sparked outrage. Internal Affairs had launched an investigation, and both officers had been placed on leave pending review. Officer Brady sat across from his superior, his expression tense. You want to explain to me why the mayor's son was treated like a criminal? The captain asked. Brady clenched his jaw. We were responding to a call, and the store clerk said he looked suspicious. We followed standard procedure. The captain's eyes narrowed. Standard procedure means escalating a situation. Where a kid was holding a bottle of water. Brady's face darkened. It wasn't about the water. It was about the way he acted. The captain leaned back, studying him. And how exactly did he act? Brady hesitated. The truth was, Malik hadn't been aggressive, hadn't resisted. He had been angry. Yes, but who wouldn't be? He had arrested real threats. Malik Carter had not been one of them. And because of that, this department is about to take a hit. You better hope the mayor doesn't come for your badge. Brady swallowed hard, because deep down, he knew that was exactly what was coming. The pressure mounts, cameras flashing, microphones pointed at him. Good afternoon, he began, his voice steady. I want to thank everyone for their support, their outrage, and their demand for justice. My son, Malik, experienced what too many black youth in this country experience. Daily racial profiling, the assumption of guilt, the fear that a simple trip to the store can turn into a life-changing event. The crowd murmured in agreement. I have spent my career fighting for fairness and accountability. The actions taken against my son were unacceptable. But this isn't just about him. This is about every black child who has been treated as a suspect before being seen as a person. This is about a system that punishes innocence while protecting bias. Applause erupted. As of today, Charles continued, I am calling for a full investigation into the police department's handling of this case. I am also working with city officials to review the policies that allow businesses to weaponize law enforcement against black citizens without consequence. The time for empty apologies is over. The time for action is now. The crowd roared with approval. Malik stood in the background, watching his father. For the first time since that day at the store, he felt something other than anger. He felt power. The city was on fire, not in the literal sense, but in the way anger spreads like a blaze, fueled by injustice. Protests swelled in numbers. Crowds flooded the streets outside Carter's grocery, chanting for accountability. Justice for Malik, and racial profiling now. You don't belong in a place like this. We belong everywhere. The news coverage had only intensified. The mayor's speech had thrown gasoline on the fire. And now there was no turning back. Inside City Hall, Charles Carter sat at a long, polished table, flanked by city officials and police representatives. The air was thick with tension. At the other end sat Chief Randolph, the head of the police department. His expression was carefully neutral, but the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed his frustration. Charles folded his hands. Chief, let's get to the point. I want your officers held accountable. Randolph exhaled sharply. Mayor Carter, with all due respect, this is not as simple as firing 2 officers. There's a process. The only process I care about is justice. Charles interrupted. Those officers humiliated and manhandled my son for doing nothing but shopping. And they did it in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. I don't need a committee to tell me what I saw with my own eyes. Randolph's lips pressed into a thin line. We are conducting an internal review. Charles shook his head. That's not good enough. I want Brady and his partner off the force. A murmur ran through the room. The chief stiffened. That's extreme. What's extreme? Charles shot back. is that my son was treated like a criminal for buying a bottle of water. What's extreme is that we are even debating whether two officers who used excessive force on a teenager should face consequences. Randolph leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mayor, let me remind you. No, let me remind you, Charles interrupted, his voice steely. The people of this city elected me to serve them, and right now, they're watching. So, you tell me, do you want to be remembered as the police chief who defended racial profiling, or the one who helped fix it? The room fell silent. The fallout for Dennis. Meanwhile, Dennis was living a nightmare of his own. The moment his termination was announced, his name and face had been plastered all over social media. People found his old posts, dissected his history, and turned him into a nationwide villain. He couldn't leave his apartment without getting dirty looks. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Most of the calls were threats. Others were reporters, eager to get his side of the story. And then, there were the people who wanted him to be their martyr. Dennis, don't let them silence you, one caller had told him. You did nothing wrong. Stand up for yourself. Another message read, the leftist mob is coming for all of us. You're a hero for protecting that store. Don't apologize. Dennis wasn't sure what was worse, being hated or being used. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a victim. He was just lost. And deep down, he was starting to wonder if he had really seen what he thought he saw that day. Malik faces the storm. For Malik, life had become something surreal. Strangers recognized him on the street. Some offered support, others shouted slurs. He couldn't even go online without seeing his name dragged into debates he never wanted to be part of. His face was everywhere, on news banners, in think pieces, on protest signs. He should have felt powerful, but mostly, he felt exhausted. One evening, as he sat on the front porch of his house, scrolling through the endless flood of opinions about his life, his mom sat beside him. You okay, baby? She asked gently. Malik exhaled. I don't know. She placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to carry all this alone. He shook his head. I don't think I have a choice. Dad's pushing for major changes. People are looking at me like I'm some kind of symbol. And meanwhile, all I wanted was a drink. His mother sighed. I know this is hard, but sometimes we don't choose to be part of history. History chooses us. Malik looked at her. What if I don't want to be chosen? She smiled softly. Then fight for the ones who do want to be. At the precinct, Officer Brady sat in a dimly lit office, staring at the internal affairs paperwork in front of him. He knew what was coming. They were going to make an example out of him. His partner had already taken an early retirement to avoid the inevitable, but Brady had dug in his heels, refusing to admit he had done anything wrong. Until now, as he sat there, he replayed the moment in the store over and over again. The way Malik had looked at him, not with fear, not with anger, with disappointment. Brady had spent years convincing himself he wasn't part of the problem, that he was one of the good ones. But now, faced with the reality of his choices, he felt the weight of his badge in a way he never had before. He wasn't sure if he deserved to wear it anymore. The boiling point. The protests had reached a tipping point. After days of demonstrations, city officials had no choice but to take action. A press conference was called, and all eyes were on Mayor Carter. The city held its breath. Would justice be served? Would real change happen? Or was this just another cycle, another outrage, another promise, another disappointment? As the cameras flashed and the world watched, the fate of everyone involved hung in the balance. The moment of truth had arrived. The city square was packed. Protesters lined the streets, their voices merging into an unrelenting chant. No justice, no peace. And racial profiling now. Justice for Malik. It was a sight unlike anything the city had seen before. The mayor's son had become the center of a national conversation, and everyone knew today was the day things would finally come to a head. At the front steps of City Hall, a podium stood, surrounded by media crews. Journalists jostled for position, cameras flashing as city officials prepared to address the nation. Mayor Charles Carter stepped forward. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and let his gaze sweep over the crowd. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today," he began, his voice carrying over the restless audience. "As you all know, nearly a week ago, my son, Malik Carter, walked into Carter's grocery to buy a bottle of water. What should have been a simple, everyday moment turned into an incident of racial profiling and police misconduct. A murmur rippled through the crowd, anger simmering beneath the surface. Charles continued, like so many black youth before him, Malik was judged not by his actions, but by the color of his skin. He was accused, detained, and humiliated for doing absolutely nothing wrong. And to make matters worse, this kind of injustice happens every day in this country, often without cameras to capture it." The crowd roared in agreement. Charles took a steadying breath. "But today, I want to make something clear. This time, there will be consequences." He turned to the side, gesturing toward Chief Randolph, who now stood beside him, looking somber. "The officers involved in the wrongful detainment of my son have been officially terminated from the force," Charles announced. Gasps and cheers erupted. "They will also face an independent investigation into their conduct," he added. "And let me be absolutely clear, this is just the beginning." The noise swelled, fists raising in solidarity. "I have spent the past week listening to the people of this city," Charles continued. "I have read your messages. I have heard your pain. And I promise you this, there will be reform. There will be new policies in place that prevent law enforcement from racially profiling our youth. And there will be accountability at every level of government." The crowd surged forward, pushing against the barriers. "We will make sure that what happened to my son does not happen to anyone else." The applause was deafening. "Dennis faces the consequences." Across town, Dennis sat in his darkened apartment, watching the press conference unfold on his television screen. His name had become synonymous with racial profiling. His face had been plastered on social media, labeled as a racist, bigot, a disgrace. He had lost his job, his reputation, and any chance of finding work in the near future. But what hurt the most was the silence. His old friends had distanced themselves. His neighbors avoided eye contact. Even people who once agreed with him now wanted nothing to do with him. He had received offers from extremist groups, people who wanted to turn him into their poster boy. But even Dennis knew better than to align himself with that kind of hatred. Instead, he sat in his apartment, drowning in regret. Had he really been so blind? Had he really let his own prejudices dictate his actions? He thought back to the day Malik walked into his store, the way he had immediately assumed the worst, the way he had whispered into the phone, telling the police that a black teen looked suspicious. He had been so sure of himself then, so confident that he was doing the right thing. Now, he saw himself for what he was, not a protector, not a concerned citizen, a coward. Malik's decision. Later that night, Malik sat in his room, watching the flood of messages pouring into his phone. Some were words of encouragement, others were filled with hate. He had become a symbol for something bigger than himself, and while part of him wanted to step away from it all, another part of him knew he couldn't. His father had made promises to the people, but real change wouldn't happen overnight, and Malik wasn't about to let this moment slip away. Grabbing his phone, he opened Twitter and typed, "This fight isn't over. We're just getting started. #JusticeForAll." The message went viral within minutes. Officer Brady sat in a cold interrogation room, hands clasped together. The internal investigation had moved quickly, thanks to public pressure. He had been officially fired, but now, there was a real chance he would be facing criminal charges. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once been the one to slap cuffs on people. Now, he was the one under scrutiny. For the first time in his life, he was being forced to reflect on the kind of officer he had been. And the truth was, he didn't like what he saw. His lawyer entered the room, setting a file down in front of him. "They're offering a deal," The lawyer said, "If you admit to misconduct, you'll avoid jail time." Brady swallowed hard. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that his badge protected him, that he was one of the good guys. Now the system he had once upheld was turning its back on him. And maybe, just maybe, he deserved it. The last word. A week after the press conference, Mayor Carter stood outside his office, watching as his city slowly returned to normal. The protests had calmed, the outrage had shifted, but the work was far from over. He turned as Moloch approached, his son looking determined. "What's next?" Moloch asked. Charles smiled. "That depends. What do you want to do?" Moloch thought for a long moment. "I want to keep fighting." His father nodded, pride evident in his eyes. "Then let's get to work." I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.